Just like the top decks that caught me by surprise last year, when I look back at the tarot decks that were fundamental to my practice over the last 10 years, I have found that some of my most mundane decks made the most magical connections. Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'm back with another prompt from Ethany's 31 Days of Tarot Community Challenge. This time we'll be chatting about the most meaningful decks of the decade and what tarot has taught me during this time. So I wanted to start this video off with two sort of honorable mentions, and I'm going to do my honorable mentions at the beginning of this video because these are decks that I don't really consider fundamental or foundational to my practice over the last 10 years, but up until 2014, these were the only two decks I owned. So they were foundational in the sense that these were the only decks that I had and I read with for quite some time. So the first one is Legacy of the Divine, and I've shown this deck before on my channel. This was the very first deck I ever owned, that I ever bought for myself. And although, I think the imagery is lovely, it does have a very masculine feel to me, and it didn't really connect with me on that sort of soul level by any stretch of the imagination. But the guidebook was really foundational to my learning to read tarot, and these images were quite powerful for me at the time. And I read with this deck for, I think, about a year, I want to say. And then I purchased the Fenestra Tarot because after a year of working with this deck that felt very sort of masculine to me and a little more kind of more of a power deck, I wanted something a little bit softer, something a little bit more feminine to kind of balance that out. Now, of course, back in those days, that was long before I joined the tarot community, and the only decks that I really saw or had access to were the ones that I saw in my local metaphysical shops, and there really weren't a lot of those around where I was living at the time. However, I did soon discover, I think, Amazon at some point and realized that Amazon carries tarot decks. And that's when I picked up the Fenestra. And I was just looking for, basically at that time, the most feminine deck I could find. Because this deck, although I didn't know much about tarot decks during that time of my practice, I really did feel that it was very masculine heavy, so I wanted something very feminine to balance it out. And I did read with these two decks together for a while, which was actually kind of weird now that I have so many decks to pull from and can be a little bit more mindful about my pairings. But they did work for me. They're both very Rider-Waite-Smith based, and although that's not really how I was taught to read tarot in the first place, I did kind of learn my way around the Rider-Waite-Smith system in order to be able to read with these two decks. And I did kind of always put my own spin on it because I had been taught to read a little bit more numerologically. I do really like this Hermit card. And these decks were really just kind of interesting to work with together. And again, this was long before I had discovered that there were such things as indie decks, and that there were multiple decks, and there were all these different types of decks out there. And so I mentioned these two because the rest of the decks that I'm going to talk about in this video are all decks that I acquired after 2014. So really closer to the middle of the decade. And prior to that, I only had these two decks. Now, I'm also not going to talk about Oracle because for me, Oracle is a fairly new part of my practice, and I've only been incorporating Oracle into my practice the last 2 years, I think. So I bought my first Oracle deck in 2017, and prior to that, I had only read with tarot, and I had never even thought about buying an Oracle deck. And it wasn't until really I got involved in the online tarot community where I learned that there were other types of Oracle decks out there besides the ones that I had seen in stores, which were primarily the Doreen Virtue type of decks, which at that time in my life really did not appeal to me. So I'm not going to discuss Oracle in this video because really the tarot decks in my collection would have been the most meaningful and the most foundational in my practice over the last 10 years. But I did just want to give honorable mention to these two decks because although they're not really my favorite in terms of art style or really any of those types of things, they were the decks that I really worked with very heavily for the first 4 to 6 years of my tarot practice, and definitely moving into the first part of this decade. So I did want to just kind of give an honorable mention to them because, they've kind of earned that over the years. So now that we've kind of done our honorable mention, let's move into the tarot decks that were foundational. My most influential deck in the last few years has got to be my Llewellyn Tarot. So this is a deck that appears quite frequently on my channel, and you might even be sick of seeing it at this point because I showed it and talked about it a lot last year. But this is the deck that really has become my comfort deck, my deck that I go to for just about everything. It's the one that I'm constantly reaching for. And sometimes I try to convince myself to use something else, but this deck just calls back to me. So for me, the Llewellyn Tarot fills that place of a comfort deck for me. It is the one that I always go to and the one that is consistently there for me. Another deck that will probably be no surprise to anyone who's watched my channel is my Anna K. And for me, this is the deck that has really become my family counselor. So it's really served an important part in my practice because it is the one deck that I consistently turn to for family questions, family readings, family issues. For me, this is the deck that kind of embodies my world, the world around me. And again, this is another deck that I'm going to be talking about more in depth and how I work with it in my practice, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But I do want to say that this is a deck that for me is a very consistent reader, and it always gives me a very straightforward, to the point message. It's a deck that's not full of a lot of esoteric symbolism, so it kind of gets down to the heart of things, down to the real, the nitty-gritty, and that is really where this deck shines for me. That is just to strip away all of the excess and to really focus in on what's going on beneath the surface. So that is the Anna K Tarot. The next deck that's been really fundamental in my tarot practice is again one that I haven't had for a very long time. It is the Shumona Tarot. And this is a deck that really does connect with me on like a soul level. This is the deck that I would say is my soul speaking to me through a deck of cards. I love the illustrations. I love the watery vibe to it. And I really love the numerological association that these cards take on. And it really resonates with the way that I go about reading. So for me, this is a deck that is really all about connecting to that inner voice, to tapping into intuition, to really tapping into my own inner wisdom and letting it shine through the imagery of these cards. That is really how my soul connects with these cards. It is through this imagery. And that is where I find the messages. That is where I find the intuitive hits. That is where I find that soul connection that really works for me. So that is the Shumona Tarot. Another heart and soul deck in my collection is the Victorian Romantic Tarot. And this is another one that's actually fairly new to my collection. It is a deck that I got at the end of 2018, but I worked with it a ton in 2019. And I would have included it in my top decks for 2019, but I instead decided to incorporate it here because for me, this is a deck that really taps into that heart space. And it's a deck that I think has really made a huge impact in my readings and really connecting with readings on an emotional level. And this deck has been fundamental for me in that way. And so it's a deck that I decided to include in this video, even though it's one I've only had for a little over a year. But it's a deck that really connects on that heart level for me. It really taps into the emotion. And while I think this might be a wonderful deck for relationship type readings, I tend to use this deck more as a type of self-care. So really tapping into my own heart space and finding the messages that are resonating there and the guidance that I need to move into that heart space and to really tap into that in my own, within my own self. So for me, this has really been a wonderful deck for that. And it's one of the few decks that I do really connect with on an emotional level in that sense. Whereas I do really connect with my Llewellyn tarot on sort of an emotional kind of soul-like connection. This for me is very much a deck of tapping into that heart space, of connecting with the heart. And that's one of the things that I really love about it. And it's one of the few decks in my collection that I can actually say really fills that void for me. It really taps into that space. So that is the Victorian Romantic Tarot. Another deck that has shown up many times on my channel is, of course, my first edition Marielle. Now, this is a deck that I have, of course, trimmed and rebacked, and it has shown up in many of my videos. This deck, this is a wonderful card to come up. This deck for me has been very fundamental to my practice because this is one of the first decks that really asked me to look outside my standard meanings, my traditional tarot knowledge. It really kind of made me take a second look at how I read tarot, and it really did show me that there is more to tarot beyond your Rider-Waite-Smith interpretations. There's a whole nother world that can exist within the tarotscape. And for me, this is a deck that really kind of merges all that together and blends it all into this beautiful tarot deck that really encompasses, in my opinion, all of the different sort of threads of tarot. So we have some Rider-Waite-Smith influences, we have some Thoth influences, we have some Marseille influences, and then you pull in all this other symbolism with this beautiful artwork, and it really just does tap into a wonderful space where it kind of asks you to step outside your comfort zone and really try something new and work with tarot in a different way. And for me, this is a deck that really does help me to tap into that. I do read with this deck more intuitively for the most part, and I think it works beautifully for that, but I think that it does really speak well to the structure and traditions of tarot, of pulling in those traditions when it needs to, and of going its own way when it needs to. And I think that's really lovely and one of the really strong points about this deck, and I think why it works so well for so many people. So it's just, of course, a beautiful deck too. The artwork is just stunning. It's very evocative. It pulls you into this lovely world that really asks you to stop, to think, and to dive deep. And it's just beautiful. So that is the Marielle Tarot. Another tarot deck that has really become quite a fundamental piece of my tarot practice is my Star Tarot. So this is, again, another deck that kind of blends all those traditions into one. We have a little bit of the Thoth, we have a little bit of the Rider-Waite-Smith, we have a little bit of the Marseille. It kind of all merges and blends together into this beautiful sort of celestial, but also very earthy imagery that really taps into, I think, the foundational or the fundamental energies of the tarot, which for me is really about connecting, creating a bridge between the higher self and the lower self, the subconscious and the conscious, the as above, the so below. And for me, this deck really beautifully does that. It definitely has that cosmic, otherworldly feel to it, but it also is very grounded in nature. And I think that that's, for me, one of the things that really pulls me towards this deck is that feeling of those two worlds coming together in harmony and in balance. And for me, that's really what this deck is about. It is called the Star Tarot, so it's definitely have those sort of cosmic influences, but then we have also these very earthy cards that bring us back down into the real world. And I think that that's really beautiful. And for me, that's, like I said, kind of what I feel tarot is in general. And it allows me to kind of connect that higher self to my lower self or my conscious self, and to pull those messages out from within and bring them into the mundane world, bring them into this reality. And for me, this deck really does that beautifully. And I love that it blends all the different traditions. I love that it is very earthy. I love that it's kind of has this shamanic feel, but also this very cosmic feel. It's a really balanced deck in that sense. And I think that one of the things that it does really well is to bring those two ideas together, those kind of polar opposites together in one deck. And I think this deck does that beautifully. So that is the Star Tarot. So the last deck that I want to share with you today is the Tarot of the She. And this is a deck that really is all about personal power for me. And I love that this card comes up, because to me, this is what this deck does. It is the deck that busts me open, that takes me out of my own limiting beliefs, out of my own insecurities, and it tells me that I have the power within me to do whatever it is that I need to do. And this is a deck that really helps me to tap into that energy. It has this wonderful earthy but also otherworldly sense about it, kind of similar to the Star Tarot. Whereas the Star Tarot for me is more of an outer manifestation of that energy, the Tarot of the She is really an inner manifestation of that energy. So this is all about tapping into my own personal power and stepping free of my own limitations, like getting out of my own way. That's what this deck does for me. It helps me to really dig deep into those places that I need to set free, and it gives me like the permission and the power to actually do the work, to make the changes, to do the work. That is what this deck is all about for me. It's all about that personal power, that going deep inside and releasing that beautiful inner energy and really tapping into that and really harnessing it and bringing it into your reality. And I think that this deck is really just a powerful tarot for that. And having trimmed it, having taken the borders off and the titles off and taking it down to just this lovely artwork has made this deck an even more powerful deck for me. It packs an even bigger punch now that these images are free. And that's another reason why I think that this deck is so important to my tarot practice, because it's again another one that by modifying it, by truly making it my own, I have really tapped into the personal power of this deck for me. And I think that that's really beautiful. And it's definitely one of those decks that makes me just want to get out there and get things done. It's very creative driven, but it's not just limited to my own creativity. It's also about tapping into my personal power to be my authentic self as well. So that is the Tarot of the She. So that's a look at the decks that have been hugely influential in my tarot practice over the last decade. Over these last 10 years, in particular the last 4 or 5, my tarot practice has really expanded to become a meaningful part of my life as a whole. It's taught me how to listen to my inner voice and to trust my intuition, to look at things from a new perspective and not always take things at face value. Ultimately, tarot has brought me clarity about who I am and what I believe about myself and the world around me. I want to again thank Ethany for putting on another wonderful community event. I will leave links for the information about 31 Days of Tarot in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this look at my decks for the decade and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.